Hey guys, how's it going? Sean here. Today we're going to be carving something really fun. We're going to be carving... Hang on, what kind of budget bullshit is this?
Like you could afford Disney.
So we're obviously not going to be carving my friend's cat. We're going to be carving the original animated Simba. The wood I'm using today is cherry. Cherry's quite a hard wood to carve with, but it's going to give us a really nice colour match for Simba's fur. These are my templates. I've just gotten some images off the internet and I've just cut out front, top and side views. Alright, so off to the bandsaw we go. Yeah, so I went around and used my mate's bandsaw and I totally forgot to film any of it, so I've cut out the side profile and top profile reasonably accurately, and we're going to be chiseling out the front profile. Always important to draw on the carving. I'm marking out the legs to work down to. So to start roughing this one out, I'm using a number 7 gouge, which I find is a good size for getting a lot of material off at the early stages. I do use a knife a little bit at this point, but the knife is going to see a lot more work when we get down to detail orientated work. Making good use of a V-tool or number 12 gouge to outline the legs here, putting in deep cuts and providing a big relief around the areas of the leg, and then I'm shaping them around those big deep cuts. Cherry, as quite a hard wood, doesn't lend itself quite as well to tearing stuff away with a knife, but it does hold detail quite well, so the knife will work for the finer details. It's always good to check your shape and form against your templates a lot when you're carving a piece like this. So what I'm normally trying to do in the rough out process is get proportions correct. So I'm trying to take this into a big blocky shape where all my dimensions are correct, and I've got a side profile, a top profile, and a front profile fully defined. And this is how I get all my proportions accurate. This is the trick, is taking those templates and carrying them through and getting them accurate in this stage of the carving. So as Simba's body is mostly made up of curves and circles, I'm taking my knife here and carving down all the sharp edges off the square form that we've made with our rough out. You may have also noticed the absence of a tail at this point. Here's going to have a separate tail made out of cherry, and I've done this because of grain orientation. If the grain was orientated in the same direction as the rest of the body, this piece would be quite weak. Now is when the bulk of this carving really starts, and that's with the head. The head is the most detailed part of this carving, it's where most of the attention is going to be going. So I'm going to start by defining the top profile of the head. And the reason I'm starting with the top here is because it has the most material to remove first, and it really defines the overall shape of the head. Say if I started with the front profile, it would be a little bit hard to even mark out the top profile as we need to remove so much material. So while I'm doing this, I'm making good use of gouges to shape the cheek areas and the muzzle areas and really define those, and also separate the ears from the rest of the face. So now that I have the top profile defined, the head looks quite silly, but I'm going to start putting in a little bit more feature into it. While I'm doing this, I'm also careful to leave space for the little tuft of hair that Simba has on the top of his head, where, no detail goes unnoticed. Giving the ears their actual height, so cutting those away. To be honest, at this stage he really looks like a dog more than anything. He's got a really large muzzle and kind of droopy looking ears. I had a lot of people at this stage on Instagram say they look like Clifford the big red dog, and yeah, I could really agree with that. So here I'm using a V-tool to come in and separate the back of the ears from the side of the head. And then now that I'm starting to get the separation between the facial features, I can start shaping the actual face itself, tapering the face up from the bottom of the cheeks to the top of the head and rounding the top of the head off. All throughout this process as well, I'm slowly defining the head further off the neck. I never really do one feature at a time. I'm always coming back to other parts of the carving and going, oh, I could take more off there. So this is definitely a part of the carving where as I take more off the head, I realise that I need to be taking more off the neck area because it becomes more in proportion with the rest of the body. So proportions are really important at this point, and I'm just trying to keep everything nice and symmetrical and even. I'm not focusing on details at all until I get further into the carving. It's much more important to get your proportions correct at this stage in the carving than to start getting bogged down focusing on the eyes or something like that. Better to get everything correct and in shape. Now to do the ears, I'm coming in with some of my little gouges and taking nice clean cuts, and I'm being very careful here because the ear is quite thin, so I don't want to take out too much. Chip out here could be disastrous. And then once I've defined a bit of a cavity with the gouge, I use my knife to define some finishing cuts around the outside of the ear and really clean up that shape. Now I'm going to start working on the front areas of the face and probably the most important areas of the carving: the mouth, the nose and the eyes. Before even touching these areas with a knife or chisel, I'm going to mark these areas out with a pencil because it gives me a chance to screw them up. Once I'm happy with what I've drawn, then I'm going to start cutting away. The other thing about marking out the eye shape is it gives me a chance to define the depth of the cheeks as well. It really looks like I'm sticking the chisel right up his nose. One of the tricks for an open mouth is making alternating cuts gently until you start getting a V-notch in the mouth area. Once you start getting an opening, you can introduce the use of small chisels to open up this area more. I don't suggest using a V-tool to create this little V-notch because you want a more acute angle for your mouth than what the V-tool will create, and you don't want to rip out the surrounding areas with your V-tool accidentally. I really like using this tiny little skew chisel to get into the back of the mouth area. And one of the other ones I like using is this number 3 5mm gouge, which is useful for smoothing out the front of the mouth area. So now Simba has most of his features apart from his eyes. What I'm really going to focus on now is refining the proportions of the face and getting things right, because at this stage in the carving I really don't think I've quite gotten it right yet. So I'm going to spend a lot of time taking off very small chips, constantly checking things, looking at it with eye, touching it with my hands, and taking off the smallest and smallest of chips until I've gotten it right down to that size where I think it looks more like Simba and less like any old little lion cub. Sometimes I'll take off a chip and then just stare at it for a couple of minutes until I figure out where I'm supposed to be taking more off. Now it's time to give him a little bit of a hairstyling, take him away from that blocky mohawk he had and give him something more like the tuft that he actually has in the movie. I'm using a V-tool here to define individual strands. I find it quite hard to carve cartoon fur. You can't just carve it like a texture like you would for animal fur, but instead it has to stand on its own. To carve the eyes, I first put in an outline cut with my knife, and then I come in with a V-tool to provide depth. As I'm carving the eyes, I'm also constantly revising the shape of the cheekbones around them and always checking for symmetry between the two eyes. Symmetry between the eyes is one of the most important things, and it's the easiest to screw up at this point in the carving. Now this is a face and head that I'm a lot happier with now. He has defined features, nice eyes, nice happy expression. He doesn't look anything like Clifford the Big Red Dog anymore. The next important detail that we've been procrastinating about until now are the paws. So we're going to attack these with a gouge to get them down to shape, and then we're going to come through and define each individual digit with a V-gouge. I love carving big paws and feet because they always look really cute, and Disney always manages to nail that look. Love me some small beans. Another handy tool that I don't mention enough are these little files. Here I'm using these files to define the shape in areas that I wouldn't be otherwise able to get a gouge into, like in the neck, between the legs and in the crook of the paws. So it's about time this lion got a tail. This is a very non-glamorous game of putting the tail on the donkey. We really don't want to get any tear out here, so we're going to be making sure to step up through 3 different drill sizes. One for a pilot hole, one to increase the size, and then one for the final size. Don't worry guys, this was consensual. Instead of this tail being straight up and down, we're going to be giving this a 2-part curve to give it a little bit more life to it. Again, like all my carvings, I'm carving this out to the square form first, and then I'm going to round this off. Even though we did this separate piece to prevent any problems with grain direction and splitting, as it does a full 90-degree turn through the grain, we're always going to have some weaknesses in the grain. It's important though that the end grain is orientated along the length of the tail where we're going to be inserting it into the body. To carve the pinion on the tail, I first score a line around in a circle at the length that I want, and then I'm going to reduce the diameter of the tail in this area to create a pin in the shoulder which will slot into the body. A handy trick for getting a nice clean fit on these areas is to undercut the shoulder of the pin a little bit. You don't need the whole joint to be flush, just the outside of the joint. It does feel like cheating in terms of fine woodworking, but we don't need this joint to be super strong. We're not going to be putting it under much stress. So you can see here, this joint is not quite perfect and there's a bit of a gap, but we're going to fix that. Get a bit of sandpaper, place a hole in the size of your pin, and then put it between the body and tail and floss them gently against each other. The next trick I do is to undercut the other side of the joint. Tight like a lion. Now for the tail tip. I'm using a small piece of walnut that I'm going to fit onto the end of the tail. This will provide a nice tonal contrast with some natural woods. We're just going to be sleeving this onto the tail, so I'm drilling this out with a Dremel, and then the taper that we've put into the tail makes this a nice snug fit just naturally. So this fine detail work calls for some very sharp tools, so I'm going to be stropping my knife on a leather strop with some honing compound, just a few strokes to pull out the bevel, and then this tool is going to be super sharp again. I do this more than I've shown throughout this video. I'm stropping regularly throughout the carving process. The tail is a nice little tuft, so we're tapering this at both ends, being careful not to blow out the area that we've drilled through. It can be a little bit hard to work with pieces as small as this one, but just be careful with where your fingers are positioned and take very small, careful cuts. We're also going to put in some of the details with the gouge prior to fitting this to the tail. To get the taper between the two woods looking super clean, I'm going to glue this on first and then smooth the transition between them afterwards. Now this video wouldn't be complete without a sanding montage. For although this guy's been sanded up to 600 grit, and now we're going to start painting. I'm using acrylics here, which I've just thinned down with water and a little bit of glass cleaner. Adding the glass cleaner helps to stop the acrylic and water splitting apart when you're working with very, very diluted paint. For most of the areas here, I want the grain to be showing through, so I'm focusing on getting smooth and even thin coats. For areas like the eyes, I want these to be more vibrant, so I will be applying multiple coats and the grain won't show through as strong. One of my favourite parts of the carving is painting in that final little white dot highlight on the eyes, because it makes the whole carving come to life and you can finally see what you've been working towards. For this carving I'm going to be finishing it with true oil, which is an oil varnish. This stuff can be a sticky mess, so I'm sticking some gloves on and I'm just going to be rubbing this on with a blue shop towel. For the first coat of finish I'm being nice and thorough and making sure that every part of the grain is nice and wet. Once I'm done applying my finish, I'm going to come back and wipe off all excess with a rag. This is really important and this is going to help you get a really clean finish. So we're going to set this aside to dry for 24 hours and then we're going to come back and sand with 2000 grit. Very lightly, just scuffing off any inconsistencies, brush off any dust and then apply another very thin coat, making sure to wipe off any excess. Rinse and repeat this until you have a finish that you're happy with. Now for probably the most frustrating detail of this whole carving, the teeth. I'm cutting down a little strip of this maple and then whittling it down to a point, and then what I'm doing is cutting it off. The trick when you're cutting it off is to make sure that you capture the cut off piece and don't let it fly across the room. Simba has good dental hygiene, so we're going to make sure to paint his pearly whites pearly white. And then the real tedious part, using some tweezers and some super glue, I'm going to glue these in. Look at that cheesy grin. We're finally finishing our game of to pin the tail on the donkey by gluing the tail in. Got to make sure to wipe off all that glue squeeze out to make it look nice and clean. So I'm super stoked with how all the details came out on this carving, especially the smooth transition between the walnut and cherry on the tail, and the use of natural colours here is perfect and really aligns with what I want to do with my carvings. So happy to see Simba finished. I'm really happy with how this guy came out. If you enjoyed this, chuck this video a like and make sure you subscribe because I'm going to be making more regular content soon. But for now, that's it from me and that's it from Simba, so Hakuna Matata and we'll see you later.
In the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. Wee, wee,